Hello, and welcome to another edition of FNR Ask the Expert. We've missed you the last few weeks. We hope you've missed us. But we're happy to be back on your schedule, and we're trying out this new time slot at noon. So we'll hopefully you'll enjoy eating your lunch and chatting about all things fall with us. Today, we're going to talk about everything from how you can impact wildlife habitat before winter hits, to what animals are out and about right now, to the all-intriguing question of what is causing my leaves to change colors, and why are some purple, and why are some red, and why are some orange? We know we like them all, but why does that happen? So today, to help us uncover all of those things, we're joined by Purdue Extension Forester Lenny Farlee and wildlife specialist Brian MacGowan. So just a reminder, we want this to be interactive. We want your questions. We want to know what you want to know. So please put your questions in the comment section here on Facebook, and we'll answer those as we go along. We'll also be providing different resources in the comment section as Brian and Lenny mentioned those, so that you don't have to try and scribble it down or copy links or things as they speak about them. So to get us started, I'm going to toss it to Lenny, because obviously the first thing we know when fall is hitting is when the leaves are changing. So Lenny, fill us in the hows and whys, and why are the leaves changing, and what's going on out there?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. It's really an interesting process, and it starts when we start getting longer nighttime periods. So as that sun starts rising later and setting earlier in the evening, it actually triggers a physiological response in trees that starts what's called an abscission layer. And it's a division layer between the twig and the leaf. And that starts the process of photosynthesis breaking down, and the chlorophylls that create photosynthesis breaking down, and revealing the colors that to some extent have always existed in those leaves through the growing season, but also colors that develop late in the season. And so it's first started by that process, and then it progresses through the season. And so there's a variety of things that can happen. Stress can actually break down chlorophyll and cause trees to show fall color early. So sometimes you'll see trees in the middle of summer that are stressed by drought, root damage, a variety of things, and we'll see fall colors on those. And it's because the chlorophyll is breaking down. But more often, it's this natural process that's daylight dependent. And I'm going to share my screen here and show a few colors that are associated with fall. And so we've actually got several pigments that are operating in tree leaves, sometimes all at the same time, and then sometimes some develop in the fall. So the green is the chlorophyll that we see during the growing season. But as that abscission layer develops, the chlorophyll starts breaking down, and we get some different colors exposed. And oftentimes what we'll start seeing are some yellows and oranges, and those are produced by pigments called carotenoids. And there's several different types that produce the different shades of yellow and orange. Those are in the leaves all during the growing season, but are finally exposed as chlorophyll breaks down. And then we have another pigment called anthocyanin that shows us the purples and the reds. And that develops later in the fall season at about the same time the chlorophyll is breaking down, is related to some chemical changes associated with sugars in the leaves. And so we get some of our most brilliant colors from the anthocyanins. And then we have another color that's also related to a pigment in the leaves, and that's from the tannins. And that's typically some of our browns. And so that middle picture with a white oak is showing some yellows, some of the carotenoids, but also some of the browns showing through with the tannins.
So I guess another question some people may have is, sometimes we see like the yellow leaves, but then there starts to be black spots and things like that. Does that mean my tree's in trouble, or is that just the way that it's evolving?
That's a great question. So later in the season, we oftentimes have some late season leaf diseases, insect feeding, or even leaf damage from a variety of different agents that'll create dark spots, bruises, or holes in the leaves. If that's something that's a big problem early in the season, that's a problem for the tree because it's cutting back on how much photosynthesis is happening. Late in the season, we typically don't worry about it too much because that tree has essentially fed itself all through that growing season. So kind of damaged and degraded leaves late in the season, not a big deal.
So Brian, I guess that brings us to you. These animals, obviously, that are out there are trying to survive, and there's less and less food out there. But what is out there for them to eat right now as we look at the change in seasons You know, what are they eating? How can we help them? And who's out there? I mean, we know some of them kind of disappear for the winter.
Yeah, so those are a lot of good questions. And so really in the fall, usually for a lot of different species of wildlife, food is really quite abundant. And so there's still a lot of shrubs that have fruit on them that a lot of animals will eat. So for example, in the fall, you'll get things like foxes and other animals will eat almost exclusively fruit material. But you also have a lot of trees that produce nuts and things that wildlife will certainly eat. Certainly with the warm weather that we still have, for example, with this week, you still have a lot of insects and other things that are out and about. And so from a food standpoint, it's really not too bad. You know, different things, eat a lot of different things throughout the year. It just depends on availability and whatnot. It's not until you really see mid to late winter and it really actually very early spring, which you see a reduction in food quantities for different species of wildlife. But, you know, even though that it's fall, it's been somewhat of a dry fall, I think, in a lot of different areas, there's still some other animals out there that you might not expect to see. And let me share my screen here just to give you kind of some examples. And so most people associate salamanders with wetlands and wet weather, you know, those kinds of things. And certainly that's true. But in the fall, you can actually see a lot of different types of salamanders. Most of our turtles and snakes are kind of spending most of their time out hidden and kind of getting ready for winter or already going through that process. But as far as amphibians go, you can still see a lot of them. The one there on that's got a marbled appearance is the marbled salamander. And so it's really unique in that they actually lay their eggs in the fall and the female will hang around with those eggs and they lay them in dry wetlands. And so when you get these fall rains, the water fills up in these wetlands and then they actually hatch and they've got a jump start on all the other ambystoma salamanders in the spring. And so it's kind of a little bit of a risky proposition. So if the water hydrology works out following the next spring, then they're going to have a head start on all those other species and they compete for resources and things within those little tiny wetlands. But if it doesn't work out, then when the conditions are much more favorable in the spring for those other species, they're going to take off in those wetlands. So it's kind of neat. But then there's also a lot of woodland salamanders that we have. Eastern redback salamander is pictured here, but there's several other species that you can still find under logs and rocks and things in the woods as you go about. And so a lot of these things are still out and about. We're kind of nearing the end of it, certainly, but there's things that are still out and about that you just kind of got to look for them from that standpoint.
So Brian, if I am out and about and I'm looking and I find salamanders, I should leave them alone. However, I should just appreciate that they're there, but let them do their thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, like looking under cover objects, that's what we call it. It's a common thing. A lot of people do it, but certainly you don't want to hold an animal for very long because they can actually dry out. So it's not good for them. And then you'd want to put it back under its cover object. So basically you'd put the rock or log back where it was and then put the animal beside it and then they're going to find their way underneath there. You never want to set the animal down and cover them up because they might not be in the right spot and you can actually hurt them that way. So that's a really good question.
We definitely don't want to hurt anybody. We like our salamanders around here, as we all know. So I guess, Lenny, back to you. Brian says there's plenty of fruit out there for our animals to eat and things like that, but what is there maybe for humans to eat? Is there still, I know we had some really bad crops with apples and some other things this year because of early frost patterns and things like that, but are there things out there right now that we could be taking advantage of?
Absolutely, there are. We did have some problems in some locations because of that late freeze we had in May. But some of our trees actually flower a little later in the season or are pretty frost hardy and produce some fruit. So some species to look at this time of year are things like walnut and hickory. Most of that fruit is going to be on the ground now, and you're going to be in competition with squirrels in a strong way to get that. But there are still trees that have produced this year. I've seen some in several locations. It's not a great crop, but it's a decent crop. Another species that you can look for, mostly planted here in central and northern Indiana, native in southern Indiana, is persimmon. And persimmon trees vary a lot. Some of them have dropped a lot of their fruit. Others still have fruit on them. But by this time of year, oftentimes that fruit is ripe. You want to make sure when you're picking persimmons that you're either picking them up off the ground and they're nice and soft, or if you get them off the trees, they're also nice and soft. And unripe persimmon is incredibly astringent. It'll literally make you feel like your head's shrinking when you're eating it. It's awful. A ripe persimmon is absolutely delicious, very sugary and sweet. Some of the things that you might still find in some places are things like wild plums or hazelnuts. Those are some other possibilities, although a lot of those will be down, particularly the plums. Same way with pawpaw. That's another kind of early fall fruit, but probably on the ground or gone, eaten by wildlife at this point in time.
So Brian, that brings up a really good question. There's some people that may not be used to having wildlife around them. And as these fruits and nuts and things are falling from the trees, might we start seeing species that we're not used to seeing? Maybe some more different types of birds, or we might be seeing more raccoons or possums or things like that that are foraging at this point?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. So the fruits that Lenny mentioned, persimmon and black walnuts, for example, those are quite large, and so birds not necessarily going to feed on those particularly. So the persimmons, that's definitely a favorite of white-tailed deer, and so certainly if you've got ripe persimmon around, there's a chance that all of a sudden you might see deer that you normally maybe didn't see in recent times. And so, with deer, we're kind of right starting up almost in the middle of the rut. And the rut in Indiana usually peaks around the middle of November. And so during that time, you've got bucks that are scent trailing does and things. And so you get some different movements going on there. And so sometimes you see deer that you normally wouldn't see. But certainly if you've got the food availability this time of year, things like raccoons and possum and things, you may not see them because they're typically more active at night, but not always. But you may see sign of them in terms of the feeding that they've done on things or tracks or even latrine sites, like that's what you call for raccoons when they do their business. And a lot of times it'll have a lot of seed and things in it. You can kind of tell what they're eating, that kind of a thing.
We'll be aware. You always want to know what's going on in your yard when you start seeing strange things, especially if you have other animals. So on that topic, though, we're talking about nuts and seeds and things that are falling. And I know a lot of people that are watching this probably are familiar with, the regeneration efforts that we're doing and things like that. Can folks be collecting maybe some of these seeds and nuts and replanting them on their own just in case the squirrels aren't doing their duties, Lenny?
Absolutely. It's something I actually have done on my property this fall. I had a timber sale recently, and it created several small openings in my woodland. And I wanted to get some walnut regenerating in those. So I was collecting black walnuts in shady areas where those walnuts don't have much of a chance to produce a good tree. Walnut needs a lot of sunlight. And I collect them in a bucket, carried them to my openings, and I used a spade just to put them in the ground in those openings. I bury them just below soil level, recognizing that I'm also feeding squirrels at the process. So I'm hopefully just increasing my odds that I'm going to get some walnut regenerated in those areas. But you can do the same thing with hickory, with the oaks. It's important to recognize, though, that when you're picking up oak, the white oak group will put out a root very quickly after it falls to the ground. And so if you collect those, you need to plant them pronto in the spring. Collect them and then plant them the same day if you can. Don't hold on to them. The hickories, the red oaks, and the walnuts, you can store those for a little while, but really the easiest thing to do is get them quickly back into the ground where you want to plant them. And in all cases, we're typically just getting them slightly below soil surface and letting some leaf litter and mulch cover them over. And hopefully if the squirrels don't eat all of them, which they typically won't, you'll get some new trees reproduced in some of those areas.
So I have a large squirrel population. I have one tree, but they really like our house. But I find the walnut pieces, the casings, if you will, all over the place. Am I going to accidentally have a walnut tree pop up in my yard somewhere? Is that something I should be concerned about?
I don't know if you need to be concerned about it. The seedlings are easily buzzed over the top with a mower and clipped right off that first season. If you mow regularly, you're not going to have problems. One thing I do see is flower beds and shrub areas. And so you may find with time, you'll have some walnut, mulberry, even oak and hickory pop up in some of your shrub lines, some of your planting beds or hedgerows on the edge of your property. And if you don't want a big tree in those locations, it's important to go ahead and control those when they're small. A lot easier to do now than later. So the squirrels and the birds are always working. The squirrels are really good at refinding, but if it's been a big crop or they've managed to miss some, yeah, they'll plant seeds for you, not always in places where you want them.
You mentioned a keyword there, Lenny, mowing. I know there's a lot of debate about that right now, Brian. I don't know if you want to tackle this or you want Lenny to, but I've seen a lot of things out there right now that you should not be mowing and not be picking up your leaves and or creating brush piles so that the animals have somewhere to go this winter. You want to hop on that one, Brian?
Yeah, sure. So mowing is definitely one technique we use to manage habitat, but usually it has a lot of limitations compared to other things like disking and prescribed fire and those types of things. But in terms of your yard, actually, it's better to mow up leaves and things and leave it there as opposed to taking those leaves off and putting them somewhere else. It acts as a slow release fertilizer. And so when you look at a lot of the lawn recommendations, if you had to pick one time, which was probably the most beneficial to fertilize your lawn, it's actually in the fall when it's putting energy down towards root growth and things like that. So it prepares it for the next year. And so by fertilizing with those cut up leaves, it actually provides a nice slow release fertilizer for the grass. And so it's got that benefit. We were just talking before this, and I guess there was an article recently talking about the benefits of tick reduction. So in other words, that if you take your leaves and you push them off into the edge of the woods, that increases ticks in the area by up to 3 times as many, which is quite substantial. So it has that benefit as well. I would disagree with you on the brush pile though, because brush piles are actually really beneficial to a lot of species of wildlife, not only in the growing season, but certainly in the wintertime. And so you can create small or relatively large brush piles within just the edge of a woods. That's a good place to do it along the wood line. And that provides habitat for songbirds. And so a lot of songbirds will actually night roost within those brush piles because it's good dense growth and it protects them from predators. But you also have brush piles that are going to be used by things like rabbits, even things like fox occasionally use them as well. And so brush piles from a wildlife standpoint actually provide some benefits.
I didn't mean to mislead people. I meant to say make them into brush piles.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you then. That's my fault.
I misspoke. That's my mistake. But so brush piles, good for wildlife. What else can we be doing for our wildlife to give them ample habitat as the seasons change?
Yeah, so actually there's a lot of things we can be doing. Some are more large scale, some could be on a smaller scale. And so in most areas, we've already had 1 or 2 frosts. And so some people think because of that it's too late to do any type of habitat control, especially with something like, for example, tall fescue. And so tall fescue is a non-native turf type cool season grass that a lot of people have in their yards. But it can be problematic in wildlife habitat because it really can hang on. It provides a very dense growth and you get a lot of thatch. And because of that, it limits what can grow with it and it limits access to the soil where things like quail and some other things want to access seeds to that bare soil. And so, and for wildlife habitat, a lot of effort is put to trying to convert fescue to other things. Right now is actually a really good time to start controlling fescue. And so you can apply a glyphosate herbicide to fescue. Even after a couple frosts, it's perfectly fine. Their grass right now is still actively growing. It's green. And so you can apply up to 2 quarts per acre of a glyphosate herbicide and burn that down. And so the next spring, then you can either convert that to some other land type, like, for example, native warm season grasses, or you can even plant trees and shrubs into something like that. or you can actually disc it. And so you can actually turn up that dead grass and expose the soil. And then that's going to allow other things like foxtail and some other annuals to come in, which is actually good for wildlife.
So while we're talking about what we might be seeing out there, Lenny, there's some things we should be watching for. He mentioned the fescue, but there's some invasive species that we really should be concerned about and that we may still be able to get a hold of this time of year to make our lives easier this spring. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know, we consider fescue invasive in many situations as compared to some of our native forbs and grasses, but we've also got some shrubs and trees that can also be invasive, not native to this area. And oftentimes they show up in the fall because being not native, they've got a longer growing season than our native plants do. And so we'll see if I can share my screen one more time here. And there we go. So one of the species that'll be most noticeable this time of year, now that our native species have dropped their leaves or the leaves have changed color at the very least, is Asian bush honeysuckles. We've got several species. And they vary a little bit in terms of shape of the leaf and texture, but all of them look relatively similar, and almost all of them hold their leaves well into November in this part of the country, even through some heavy freezes and frosts. And if they're out in the sun, a lot of times they will also have these little red berries on them as well. And so that's something that a landowner can do on their property is at this time of year, scout for invasive species by looking for what's still green and growing. And in many cases, if it is, that's an indication that it's probably not native. Now, we do have a few plants that will continue to be green through the growing season, things like greenbrier, Christmas fern. But if you see a lot of large shrubs like this occupying the forest understory where there normally would have been shade, very good chance we've got Asian bush honeysuckle. And then also through parts of Indiana, particularly southern Indiana, we can have Japanese honeysuckle, close relative, but a vine, but also tends to be green through the growing season, and also some other ground covers like winter creeper. So this is a great time of year to scout for these plants on your property. And then also because, as Brian said, you still have green leaves, still actively growing, we can use herbicide materials like glyphosate as a foliar spray on these, usually mixed at about 2 to 3% concentrate to the balanced water, and get good coverage on that foliage. And if it's still nice and green, the leaves are strongly attached to the trees, we can oftentimes get good control. And since everything else is dormant, we typically don't have a lot of impacts to native species with those sprays at this time of year as well. So it's a great time to scout and also control these invasives.
Lenny, as we talk about species, I know right now we're talking about what we should be doing to prepare for winter, but now is also a good time to start planning for spring, for planting season. I know we talked about that about a month ago, about conservation tree planting, but so are those some of the things that maybe I should be talking to professionals like you or other foresters about at this time of year, as I have maybe that winter to kind of put my plan together?
Yeah, it's great to do planning ahead of time for spring tree planting. And so if you're looking at conservation style tree planting, like we talked about a few months ago, we're typically talking about bare root seedlings, and they really are best planted in the spring. And many of the nurseries have already opened their orders, and so they're taking orders right now for spring planting. So it's a good idea to get your list together, kind of plan how many seedlings you need, talk to your forester about recommended species, and get that order in, so you've got a better chance of getting the trees you need. And then also, Brian mentioned another thing. Fescue is one of our biggest competitors with tree growth when we get ready to plant into open areas. And so doing that weed control this fall really sets us up for success and an earlier potential planting date next spring. So definitely some things we can do in consultation with your professional foresters and wildlife biologists to get ready for your habitat management and plantings next spring.
So to go back to what you said, both of you mentioned this about things being green right now. So are all things that are still green right now bad? Are there some that are going to stay that way? Obviously, we know certain trees are green year round, but are there certain things, maybe you mentioned Asian bush honeysuckle and some of those other invasives, but are there some others maybe I should be aware of that are okay for them still to be green year round?
Yeah, there's a lot of plants that are beneficial. For example, with vines, there's a lot of greenbrier vine species that are native. A lot of people may not like them because they're kind of a thorny thing, but they're actually really good to have around if you like woodland songbirds. Certainly some of our Christmas fern is an overwintering kind of a fern that stays green throughout the winter. And so just because it's green mid to late fall doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad plant. But if something is really doing well and there's a lot of it and it's green this time of year, it's probably a clue to actually trying to determine what that is. Sometimes with landowners, and professionals, we struggle sometimes with plant ID, particularly with stuff, wildflowers and things like that. There's so many different species of. If it's something you're not working on all the time, you tend to lose that. And there's a couple apps out there that Jared Brook did a program on recently. One of them I like is the Seek app, and you just take it and with your phone, and you'll kind of take show different parts of the plant, and it'll get it down from family to species. And it's actually pretty effective, particularly with things that you find out in nature and things, or even in your own backyard. I was quite impressed with it and doing some testing and things on it this fall, and it pretty much got you pretty close to it.
And Lenny, we've also mentioned the tree identification app and the plant ID apps that exist within our horticulture and entomology departments. Do you want to talk a little bit about what people can do with those if they have questions about trees and shrubs?
Yeah, there's a variety of good apps, both from Purdue and from other sources. I'll be honest, I don't use them because I learned tree ID way before we had apps. But there are some very good ones. The other thing I would encourage people to look at is a good field guide. And so things like 101 Trees of Indiana by Marion Jackson. There's several that are available that actually tune into Indiana or the Midwest. Those are really nice tools. There's also a really nice online tool through Purdue University. I don't think I gave you this resource, Wendy, but it's the Purdue Arboretum. And so folks could simply do a web search on Purdue Arboretum, and they have a tree finder on there. And so if it's been planted on campus, they've got information on it, and oftentimes a nice set of photos. And I use that tool every now and then to get some photos for some programming I do. So some great resources. We're getting into the time of year now where tree ID becomes tougher because the leaves are on the ground and the wind is blowing them around. So even if you pick up a leaf, you don't know whether it's the tree you're standing under or not. It may be somebody that's a neighbor. There's even a few guides out there that are specifically for winter tree ID, for twig ID. And one of my hopes is in some future videos to do some work on that too myself.
And brief plug here, if you don't know what Lenny's talking about and you haven't followed his ID That Tree series, you're missing out, because you will learn all about a bazillion different native species that some you didn't even know were native, how to identify them from the bark, the leaves, the leaf arrangement, and even sometimes where you see them and some of the like flowers and berries and things you might see. So I'll put the link to that in the Facebook chat. Just a reminder also, if you have questions, I know we've covered a lot of ground today, throw those in the Facebook chat as well, and we'll answer your questions. But certainly want to give Lenny a plug. He does work very hard, and I know he has a great fan base amongst you watching this right now. But certainly, and especially the fall foliage ones we have coming out here soon, so you know what you're looking at as you go out in your neighborhood as well. So thanks for that, Lenny.
Wendy, one other resources I want to get in there too is there's a publication that was written by some of our former Purdue colleagues on shrubs and woody vines of Indiana and the Midwest. And so they've written a couple of publications, one on trees and one on the shrubs and woody vines. So not only do they have really good identification information, natural history information, but they also include wildlife uses of each of those species, which for some things it's really kind of hard to get good information on. And so they talk about that, and also applications and landscaping use, because not everything's the same. So, natives are great, but some of them, sometimes there's challenges to planting native shrubs and things in your yard because they grow differently. They're not a cultivar. And so you can get things like root sprouts and things like that that you may not anticipate with things that you would buy at the nursery.
That's great advice as well. We certainly want to make sure we're planting the right things and we're feeding the native environment. As we look outside right now, I know a lot of people get concerned. We're kind of past the baby animal season, hopefully, except for you mentioned some of the salamanders. Are there things like that that we should still be cognizant of? I know you mentioned the deer rut. Is that something that people who maybe aren't used to being out in that environment should be cognizant of?
Well, there's not too much with the baby animal stuff, but you know, you could do some maintenance type things. So if you have nest boxes, you can clean them out. And so most species of birds will actually do that themselves, but you can help them out a little bit. You can clean those out. Sometimes what you'll find, especially if it hasn't been used for a while, if you clean it out now, you may have things like white-footed mice in there, or if it's a large enough nest box, you may have a screech owl or something like that that's roosting inside of it. Back in the day when I used to volunteer at one of the fish and wildlife areas north of Ohio State where I went, we'd go around and we'd clean out wood duck boxes, and sometimes we find screech owls and those things just kind of hanging out. So sometimes you'll never know what you can find. The other thing is it's a good time of year to build some, and so you can build some and put those out in anticipation of next spring. And so bluebirds and some other species will start utilizing those nest boxes depending on where you're at into April or maybe even late March. And so you've got a period of time now where you can maybe do some planning and figure out what projects you want to build and where you're going to put them and that kind of a thing.
Great. Lenny, anything, I know this is probably more urban forestry. This is more Lindsay's department, but are there things as I'm looking at my trees, as it's going to frost, as it's going to start icing, as it has some other places in the country, are there things I should be worried about in my woodland areas, as well as my maybe backyard, when it comes to branches and all of those type of things, as we look towards winter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to probably tune into the woodland area a little bit more because that's what I'm familiar with. But one thing we look out for, and you've got to kind of make some decisions what your objectives are for your property, but thinking about grapevines. And so grapevines are native here in Indiana, and they provide some really important wildlife benefits in terms of food and cover, nesting materials, but they also present a risk to trees that you want to see grow, both from competition, from shading, but also if we were to have a heavy wet snow or ice storm event, they're extra weighting in the tops of trees. And so they can tear out crowns, break out branches. And so what we oftentimes recommend is if you really want to see a tree to continue to grow and do well, cut vines that go up into the tops of those trees. And if you've got a good shady forest, you can just cut that vine. It'll probably resprout a little bit, but it can't tolerate shade, and so it's not going to survive. If you want to retain some vines on your property, pick areas where we've got edge areas on the outside edge of the woods, near stream corridors, or in trees that you really don't care about the fate of that tree so much, and you're thinking more about the wildlife habitats that the grapevine provides, the benefits that they provide. So looking for grapevines is a great thing to do. The other thing you can do is this is a nice time of year to go out and cut some firewood, either for campfires or your own personal use. There's opportunities to do improvement and vigor enhancement in your woodlands by taking out undesirable trees that are competing with desirable trees. And you may be able to make those selections, or you might want to have a forester come and help you make those selections. But this is a nice time of year to do that kind of work as well.
And Brian, speaking of tree damage or things like that, just because a tree has fallen or broken doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Those can often be habitat for bats and some other species. So I guess, what should I do if I find a semi-fallen tree in my forest?
Well, it kind of depends on what you're using it for and that kind of thing. So anytime you have dead standing trees and it's an area that you're using for trails, or it's along the edge of the yard or something like that, you know, you've got to be concerned about, you know, broken limbs falling or the whole thing falling, those types of things. And that definitely is a concern. But if you've got trees just out in your woods that are dead or dying, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's a lot of wildlife species, not only birds, but also a lot of our mammals, for example, with many of our bats, gray fox, raccoon, they all use cavities. And so dead and dying trees are a lot of times a good source of those natural cavities that they use. And so that's you know, there, it's good to have from that standpoint, certainly. In terms of numbers and size, you really want a diversity, because there's little animals that like little cavities and big animals that like big cavities. But if you really got to kind of pick and choose, having larger trees that have cavities and things in them are more desirable, because those larger trees are also going to have smaller trees, and the whole thing's going to last longer as well, than as opposed to a smaller kind of a tree.
So another question, Brian, is some of us that live in suburban areas, we mentioned possums and raccoons and things that might be popping up in our areas, especially if we create these brush piles and things like that for them. Should we be concerned? Sometimes they might be crawling under our sheds or trying to get in our garages or some of those places that keep them warm. Is that something we should be aware of, and how do we avoid some of those maybe negative wildlife interactions?
Well, anytime you do something to benefit wildlife, whether that be intentional or unintentional, can be unpredictable what you're going to get. And so in any kind of a neighborhood or place, there's always the potential for things like, for example, striped skunk. And I would be willing to bet most people don't want skunks hanging around their yard and things. So brush piles sometimes can be an attractive feature for that. But certainly regardless of what you're doing from that standpoint, it's always a good idea to limit access underneath sheds and porches and things like that. And really, to do it right, it takes a little bit of elbow grease and some time and some money. And so the material of choice is typically a 1-inch galvanized after welding hardware cloth. And so you would limit access not only below the shed, but under a foot underground and a foot outside, be it like away from the thing you're trying to protect, because there are things, for example, groundhog that are very good diggers, and they can dig under things. And so that's really the best way to really eliminate that threat. And if you don't do that, then you're still kind of running the risk of having something dig under there that maybe you don't want. For example, you can even have moles do that. And so if you've got something that doesn't go below ground to a certain extent, all of a sudden you could have moles underneath a shed or a porch, and you really can't access them. So if you're trying to set a trap or do something like that, you've essentially got a place where it's kind of a safe haven for them. So you're always going to kind of deal with that mole problem.
And none of us want moles.
Yep.
You got to find a good
dog. It's like anything else. To do it and do it right, it takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of time and elbow grease. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
So I guess in summing up, a few things we want to bring up to people: check for invasives. Don't necessarily rush out to keep mowing your yard and getting rid of your leaves and handing those out to the trash man. They can be useful. Maybe start planning for creating some projects, whether that be for your woodland areas or for the wildlife species you want to attract. Anything else I missed?
Brian mentioned the importance of standing dead timber in forests, and I mentioned cutting firewood, but you don't necessarily have to cut those trees for firewood. You can girdle those trees, ring all the way around with a chainsaw about 1 inch deep, or even take a hatchet and cut out the bark, the cambium, and a little bit of the sapwood all the way around the tree. Leave those standing, and that's a good source of wildlife habitat. Plus, we've created extra growing space for the trees that you want to favor.
We also want to mention, don't move firewood. Don't try and take that firewood that you cut on your property if you go and set a campfire or something on a national park. And a lot of those places, they won't even allow you to bring in firewood. So we want to get the plug in there for the don't move firewood people, because certainly that is an important thing when we're talking about spreading invasives, right, Lenny?
Yeah, there's an enormous number of insects and pests and pathogens that can be harbored in firewood that you don't even realize it's there. And if it's not completely burned at the location you take it to, it can sit there and disperse whenever it's able. And so that's how an awful lot of our problems have been created.
Brian, anything we missed from the wildlife end? Creatures or animals we should be looking out for, things we can be doing to take care of them, maybe projects we might have that we aren't thinking about?
I think, we covered that from that standpoint. Creation of brush piles and nesting structures now is not a bad idea, but certainly if you're doing any habitat work next year, now's the time to really start stressing the site preparation, whether you're trying to burn down some tall fescue or something like that.
And Lenny, I dropped the Find Indiana Forester link in the comments section. I know that's a valuable resource there. Brian, is that I know most of the counties are going to have an extension person that can help them with wildlife habitat.
Yeah, so if you're like on rural areas and you're looking at, say, trying to do something with native worm seeds and grasses or something similar to that, the state does have district wildlife biologists who do serve some counties, and so they're biologists for the state, and they can link you with cost share and technical assistance as well. A lot of that is run through not only the state Department of Natural Resources, but also the USDA service centers that run the Farm Bill programs and some of those other things.
Well, great resources. I'm sure, I know I enjoy watching the trees change, maybe not the weather drop as much, but certainly Lenny has educated us on why the trees are changing and how that's a good sign. Certainly if you have trees that are changing earlier in the season, although there might be some species that's okay, Lenny, like in the summertime.
Yeah, our trees kind of run on different schedules. And so we have some species like buckeye that leaves out really early and then drops its leaves really quick. And that's kind of its strategy in terms of how it makes it in the woodlands. We've got other species like sassafras, and I saw somebody mentioned in the chat black gum, that we can get some early color. And it's just a characteristic of those species, sometimes where they're growing, but oftentimes associated with particular species and the genetic variation in those. So early fall color is not necessarily an indication of problems, but mid-season fall color probably is. That's usually an indication of some kind of significant stress.
So again, reach out to your local forester if you have questions and you think there might be a concern. If you have issues identifying what you have on your property, again, some of those apps that we put in the comment section are great, valuable resources. The Tree Doctor is another one that Purdue has that you can use to see if there might be a problem with your tree. You can actually take pictures of the leaves and compare it on the app. It's a great resource that our entomology folks and our plant pathology folks have created. And so plenty of resources there for you. I hope that you enjoy learning all about the things you can be doing to prepare for winter, although we're not ready for it yet. I'll take some more of these 70-degree days, and I think Lenny and Brian would too.
Definitely.
So, we're going to turn our gears toward those deer that Brian was mentioning earlier. Next week, we'll be talking about deer processing. How can you get the most out of your meat by processing your own, and seasonings you can use, even some cooking tips and things like that. Jared Brook and Rod Williams and a couple of our county extension specialists are going to be on that. So tune in next Thursday, same time, noon. I know it's a new time schedule, but put us on your calendar for lunchtime, and you might even learn how to cook a few new recipes next week. So we will see you then. And thanks, Brian. Thanks, Lenny, and happy fall.